Imagine having everything: power, wealth, influence. You're a billionaire living a life most only dream of. But there's one thing missing: your family. The ones who supported you, loved you, and shaped who you are. You walk away thinking it's the price of success. Years go by, and you're surrounded by luxury, yet something inside begins to feel off. What you thought you wanted starts slipping through your fingers. As time passes, regret becomes a shadow, lurking just out of sight, but never truly leaving. The empty spaces in your life start to speak louder than the accolades and achievements. The question becomes, can you ever go back? Or is it too late to make amends for the choices that have already cost so much? In this story, we explore the life of a man who chose money over family, success over love, only to find that what he left behind was worth more than any fortune. But now, after years of living in the lap of luxury, the weight of regret is too much to ignore. Can he fix what he broke? Or is it all gone forever? Stay tuned, because the truth is more complicated than you might think. Years had passed since the decision was made, the decision to leave everything behind, to pursue a life of grandeur and success, abandoning the family that had always been there. It wasn't that the man didn't love them. He did, deeply. But in the ruthless world of business, where deals were made on a handshake and fortunes could change in the blink of an eye, he was convinced that the price of his dream was steep, but worth it. There was always time to repair the relationships later, right? Or so he thought. In the beginning, the days were filled with excitement, the thrill of moving into the next big venture, the challenge of conquering markets and proving himself. He threw himself into the work, convinced that his success would somehow make up for the absence in his personal life. The more wealth he gained, the more distance grew between him and his past. It was easier that way, wasn't it? Easier to not think about the phone calls that went unanswered, the holidays spent alone in lavish homes, the birthdays he missed each moment of absence, only deepening the void that couldn't be filled by any amount of money. But as the years slipped by, something shifted. The constant rush of business, the endless stream of meetings and contracts, began to feel hollow. What was once a source of pride had become a weight that pressed on his chest. The more he built his empire, the more the silence in his life grew unbearable. The company was thriving, his name was known across the world, but it didn't matter. None of it mattered. It wasn't until he stood alone in his penthouse, gazing out over a city that never slept, that he truly understood the price of his choices. A life of luxury, power, and influence wasn't enough. It was all meaningless, without the people he loved. And so began the internal struggle. Regret settled in like a heavy fog, clouding his thoughts, making everything feel distant and uncertain. He thought about the moments he'd missed, the milestones his children had reached without him there to witness them. He thought about the birthdays, the graduations, the anniversaries, all the things that had once mattered, but now felt out of reach. But even in this new emotional turmoil, there was something holding him back, a fear that perhaps, after all these years, it was too late. Too much damage had been done. The relationships he had once taken for granted had moved on. His family had learned to survive without him, to thrive without him. They had rebuilt their lives in ways he could never have imagined. Would they even want him back now? Would they ever forgive him? As he grappled with these questions, another part of him began to wonder, what if he wasn't the only one who had changed? What if, just as his life had evolved in unexpected ways, so had theirs? Was it possible that they too had evolved into versions of themselves that no longer needed him, no longer saw him as the person they once knew? The tension between his old life and the new one became unbearable. He had achieved everything he set out to accomplish, yet he felt empty. The wealth, the power, the prestige, they had all come at the cost of something far more valuable: The problem wasn't just the absence of his family. It was the realization that he didn't know how to navigate the space between the man he had become and the man he once was. Could he go back? Could he become someone different? Meanwhile, far from the lavish offices and boardrooms, his family was not sitting idly by. They had moved on, yes, but that didn't mean they were unaffected. His absence had shaped them in ways that were hard to understand. There was pain, of course, but there was also resilience. The family had learned to support each other in ways that were both beautiful and heartbreaking. They had grown stronger, more independent, but at the cost of a certain vulnerability. His children, once wide-eyed and innocent, had matured into adults, each with their own set of dreams and struggles. They had faced the world without the security of their father's presence, and in some ways, they had thrived. But there was an underlying current of unresolved feelings, anger, abandonment, and a longing that could never truly be extinguished. They had learned to live without him, but they hadn't forgotten. The wife, too, had changed. She had once been the partner who stood by him through everything, who supported his ambitions and believed in his vision. But years without him had eroded that bond. She had her own life now, one that didn't need him to be complete. She had built her own identity, her own strength, her own sense of independence. And though there was still a flicker of love left, it was hard to ignore the walls that had been built in the years he was absent. Forgiveness didn't come easily, especially when it was not just the heart that had been hurt, but the soul. In his attempt to repair what he had broken, he discovered that the task was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. He couldn't just walk back into their lives and expect things to be the way they were. They weren't the same people anymore, and neither was he. They had their own lives to live, and his return, if it were ever possible, would require them to open old wounds that they had long since closed. The tension between what he wanted and what they needed became a constant battle. He knew that he couldn't undo the past, but could he somehow rewrite the future? Could they ever rebuild the trust that had been shattered? Or was it too late for second chances? And yet, even as he struggled with these questions, a part of him still held on to hope. Hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to heal the wounds, to bridge the gap between the past and the present. Hope that the love they once shared could find a way back into their hearts. But with each passing day, that hope began to fade as the reality of the situation set in. The more he tried to fix things, the more he realized how little control he had over the outcome. The road to redemption was long, and it wasn't just about seeking forgiveness, it was about learning to live with the consequences of his actions. And in the silence that followed each attempt to reconnect, he realized that the true battle wasn't against the distance between him and his family, but against the haunting question of whether he was even worthy of a second chance. But as the story unfolds, the question remains, will he ever find a way to make amends, or is the damage irreparable? Can he truly find peace, or is he destined to live with the regret of what could have been? The answers may lie in the most unexpected places, but for now they remain just out of reach, shrouded in uncertainty. After years of running from the consequences of his decisions, the billionaire found himself standing at the threshold of a new chapter, though he wasn't sure if it was a beginning or an ending. The tension within him had reached a breaking point. He knew that trying to control the situation was futile. What he had come to realize over the past few months was that he wasn't the same man who had left his family behind so many years ago. Nor was his family the same. Time, the most unforgiving force of all, had transformed them in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. The first step had been an unexpected message, a simple yet powerful text from his daughter. It had come after years of silence, and in it, she had written only one sentence: "I'm not angry anymore, but I need to see you." The simplicity of it stunned him. For so long, he had imagined a confrontation, a barrage of questions, perhaps even anger. Instead, her message had been quiet, filled with a maturity that took him by surprise. It was as if the years of pain and hurt had faded into something else, something he couldn't quite name. The only thing he knew for certain was that the moment he read those words, everything in him shifted. It was time to face the reality of what he had done, and perhaps more importantly, to face the reality of who he had become. The wealth, the power, the success, it had all come at an enormous price, and now, he needed to figure out if it was possible to rebuild the relationships he had torn apart. He had to accept that redemption, if it was even possible, wouldn't come easily. It would take time, patience, and, above all, honesty. The meeting with his daughter was awkward at first. The words didn't come easily, and there was a certain distance between them, a space that neither of them could bridge immediately. But as the hours passed, they found their way back to each other. There were moments of silence, moments of shared vulnerability that neither of them had anticipated. His daughter, now an adult with her own life, was no longer the child who had once cried out for her father. She had her own dreams, her own struggles, and her own strength. Yet, despite everything, there was still a piece of her that longed for the man she had lost. It wasn't about forgiveness, at least not yet. It was about the possibility of finding a way forward, one step at a time. The conversation shifted from their past to the present, and soon, it became clear that the wounds they had both carried for so long weren't as deep as they seemed. Time had healed them, not completely, but enough to allow for a conversation. And in that moment, he realized something that he had been too afraid to admit before. He had been running from the very people who could offer him the redemption he so desperately sought. He wasn't the only one who had been hurt by the distance between them. His family had suffered too. But in that shared suffering, there was an opportunity to rebuild, to start anew. His next step was to reach out to his wife. The years of distance between them had built walls that he wasn't sure he could break down. Yet, when he finally sat down with her, he found that the walls weren't as impenetrable as he had feared. She had lived a full life without him, and though there was still love between them, it was different now. The relationship had evolved, as had they both. She had learned to rely on herself, and she had created a world in which she didn't need him to feel whole. But there was something in her eyes when they spoke, a glimmer of something that suggested there might still be a way back. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be the same as it had been before. But there was potential. There was hope. As they spoke about their past, they also spoke about their future. It wasn't about going back to what they once had. It was about moving forward, acknowledging the pain, and finding a way to build something new. They weren't going to fix everything overnight, and there would be bumps along the way. But for the first time in a long time, they both saw a future that included each other, just not in the way they had imagined it years ago. But it wasn't just about his family. As he sat there, reflecting on the course of his life, he realized that the most important relationship he needed to repair was the one with himself. He had spent so many years chasing success, trying to prove himself to the world, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. The truth was, he had been running from his own pain, from his own guilt. He had convinced himself that success would fill the emptiness inside him, but it never had. He began to realize that the journey of redemption wasn't about seeking forgiveness from others. It was about forgiving himself. It was about accepting the fact that he had made mistakes, that he had hurt people, and that he couldn't change the past. But he could control his actions going forward. He could make amends, one step at a time, and that was a far more powerful path than any amount of money or success could offer. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, he found himself taking small, deliberate steps to rebuild his relationships. Not just with his family, but with himself. He learned to be present, to listen more, to value the things he had once taken for granted. He didn't expect everything to be fixed overnight, and he didn't expect to be forgiven immediately. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he was finally facing his past, and in doing so, he was creating a future where he could find peace, not through success or wealth, but through genuine connection and self-acceptance. Through all of this, the one thing he learned above all else was that there are no shortcuts to redemption. It's a long, difficult road, and it requires humility, patience, and, most of all, the willingness to confront the truth about who you are. His journey had been one of success and failure, of gain and loss. But in the end, it was the simple act of showing up, of being there for the people who mattered most, that proved to be the greatest reward of all. The billionaire, once driven solely by ambition, had learned that the real riches in life aren't measured in dollars or accolades, but in the relationships we nurture and the lives we touch along the way. And in that quiet, profound realization, he found something far more valuable than anything he could have ever imagined: a sense of peace, a sense of belonging, and the knowledge that, while the past could never be erased, the future was still his to shape. And so, the story of a billionaire who left his family behind, only to find regret years later, came full circle. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real. It was a story of growth, of making mistakes and learning from them, of embracing the messiness of life and finding beauty in the imperfections. In the end, it wasn't about the money or the success, it was about the people who mattered most. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the greatest lesson of all.